Perfect.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Misconceptions. So glad that you're here. We have with us today a friend and colleague, which I feel like I say every single time I launch the podcast is like, here's my next friend and colleague because I'm that lucky. Welcome, Abby Grayson.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad that you said yes. And we were able to coordinate this kind of time to meet together. So, the reason I want us to talk today, just kind of to launch right into it, is that I've met you. I met you actually at a conference, and we came to discussing some of the kind of your reproductive story, your reproductive history, and
Mhm.
which is not typically the things we just kind of like right off the bat. Hi, how are you? What's your reproductive history? But we did do that. We did get there pretty quickly in
Mhm.
conversation. And your story is particularly relevant, I think, to the Ashkenazic Jewish community because of some of that genetic history and genetic loading that some of us really don't give that much consideration to, other than the classic Ashkenazic Jewish genetic diseases. And then your story kind of unfolds in that within that construct, and I think that that's such an important conversation. So before we get into the personal stuff, can you please tell everybody who you are professionally?
Sure. So I am Abby Grayson. I am a licensed professional counselor. I have been doing counseling for 15 years or more, the last 12 of which have been in, oh no, maybe more than that, then I guess. So, because 12 years in private practice, so longer in general. And I have my own practice, general practice, where I also have a focus. On infertility counseling, which is how we met, as well as women's trauma. I do a lot of that, working with survivors of abuse, domestic violence, and childhood sexual abuse. So, yeah, that's basically what I do in a nutshell.
Okay, amazing. And where do you live? Like, where are you located?
I'm in central New Jersey, just outside of Princeton.
Okay. So let's begin with I think I'd like to you to begin with where you began to understand that there might be difficulty in conceiving, that there may be
Mhm.
a challenge in knowing that having children for you might be a little bit different than others. Why don't we start there?
Sure. Yeah, so I had been married for a few years, and sort of blissfully unaware, on birth control and thinking, everything was good and normal, and I was just gonna hold off on having kids for a few years, enjoy marriage. Got married when I was 27, so around 30 is when I started thinking about trying to conceive, and came off birth control, and at that point never regained my cycle, so I never basically got another period after that. Which seemed odd to me, but for some reason did not trigger the alarm of any physicians, oddly. So that went on for maybe about a few months, and I started, kind of asking questions. I started doing some research online. Um, Finally, started taking ovulation predictor test kits, which measure FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, as you know, and many of your listeners probably know. And it started coming up positive basically all the time.
Oh,
And so every time I took a test, it was positive, and I said, "This can't be right, right?" So I asked my gynecologist, who told me that I should stay off of Google, not worry my quote unquote pretty little head about it. Those were his exact words, and I should keep off the internet. And I was like, because the internet basically said this is bad. This is not a good sign, right? If you have constant measure of FSH, high FSH, then you have a problem. So he kind of wrote it off. And then after a few more months, I took myself to the reproductive endocrinologist, who basically did an ultrasound of my ovaries, took one look at me, and said, you're not going to ever have your own children. Your choices are donor conception or adoption, which was, certainly very, very shocking. I was 30 years old. I had no idea that any of that was a potential issue. Very caught off guard. So that's basically how I got there.
so for somebody who might not be familiar with like kind of like the testing that gets done at that time,
Mhm.
taking a look on an ultrasound at your ovaries, what are they not seeing or what are they seeing at that point?
Right. So actually, my gynecologist, the one who told me not to worry about it, had done an ultrasound of my ovaries and had told me that they were okay. Which I guess apparently he couldn't remember how to read the ultrasound results. But when and he later said that he told my husband, who's a fellow physician, that he couldn't quote unquote remember everything he learned in medical school,
Oh, wow, real
which is
winner. Such a winner.
right. You're a
Right.
gynecologist. That's pretty much your only window is that little area
Yeah. Wow.
of the
Okay.
body. You should pretty much know how to do that. But so anyway, the point of all that being that always advocate for yourself, always ask a lot of questions, never accept kind of answers that don't feel right to you. Because I knew that when my research turned up that this, constant positive result on the ovulation predictor test was really a big red flag. I knew in my gut that there was something wrong. I also knew I didn't feel right. My hair was changing. I was tired. I was having hot flashes, basically all of your symptoms of menopause, which is what I was in, ovarian failure. And I was in graduate school at the time. He told me, oh, you must just be stressed. You're in graduate school. And I was like, I don't find that particularly stressful. So, point of all that, not just to knock the doctor, but to say, always trust your gut and your instinct and,
Hmm. Hmm.
push for what you need, which is why I
Right.
took myself to the RE. Anyway, so the ultrasound, what they did see was that my ovaries were shriveled. Basically, they should look kind of plump and healthy, like more like a grape. And instead they look more like raisins, if that makes sense. So shriveled, atrophic, it would be the medical term. Basically just what you would see if you were looking at a menopausal um, ovary.
And the increased
And that's
level
what
of
they saw.
FSH and the increased level of FSH in your blood was telling
Mhm.
what to the physicians?
Basically that my egg reserve was no more, that there was no ovarian reserve, that there was basically
Right.
I was in the postmenopausal range. My FSH was 162 when they tested it. It's supposed to be somewhere between 5 and 10, I believe is
Wow.
the
Okay.
normal number. So, very, very high. And that it's basically an indication of ovarian reserve.
Right. And so at
So
that point
that
in time,
number coupled with the
the
ovary
presentation, right?
ultrasound. Hmm.
Uh-huh. And did
Yep.
they have a reason for you at this time?
They had no reason for me. Another thing that I would, sort of encourage people to ask all the questions, because that really bothered me. I sort of said, of course, trying to process my shock and dismay. I said, well, why? How could this be? What would have caused this? And um, reproductive endocrinologists really aren't in the business of diagnosing. They more want to figure out how you can go forward and how you can get pregnant. That's their business. Um, so they basically told me they didn't know, and they would, be able to help me get pregnant with donor eggs, and that they weren't too worried about what the reason was, if you can believe that.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. Like it doesn't
Hmm.
almost matter to them why as much as
Exactly.
it addresses, okay, but how do we fix the problem kind of thing.
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly.
But you took a different route. You made the decision that you were going to try to figure out why. And what did you find out?
Right. Right. So yeah, it really bothered me to not know why. I didn't understand how could I be 30 years old and basically, completely infertile, in full menopause. Also, what was that going to mean for me and my body? When I asked the reproductive endocrinologist, or well, will I have to be on hormones? What's going to happen to me? Again, sort of, oh yeah, you'll probably need hormones, but it's not their place to figure out a plan. So I did some more research, and this is going back to 2008. So um hard to believe, but the internet was a different place then, even
Yeah,
then.
sure.
Right, these days it's a little bit easier. You can kind of find a group online for everything. You can easily get connected with other people in a similar situation, which is great and a blessing. But at that time, there was really very little social media, if any. I think Facebook had like really just gotten started for the mass population. It's a little bit of a black hole and trying to kind of figure things out in the dark. But I did find a doctor who was an early menopause, which is what they were calling it, specialist. And she worked at the time out of Montefiore in New York City. So I went to see her, and she was great, phenomenal. Nanette Santoro is her name, and she is now at the University of Colorado and heads their gynecology department, and still doing a lot of work in premature menopause. So she said, "Okay, well, here's the thing. I think there's three possible causes for this. One is that it's autoimmune. The second is that we'll never know, and the third is there's some very new research tying premature menopause to being a carrier of a condition called Fragile X. She's like, so I doubt it's that, but let me run some blood work, right? And she's like, I'll do some tests for autoimmune stuff. I'll do some tests for the Fragile X. And if it's neither of those things, then, we chalk it up to, one of those life's mysteries. So,
Right.
right. 3 weeks later, she called me and she said, she's like, I didn't expect it, but you're a carrier of the Fragile X. Premutation is what she called it. And that's without a doubt the reason that your ovaries have failed. So,
Okay.
mhm,
So talk to me about what you understood, or even more about what you understand now about Fragile X. And the reason I
right.
think this is so crucial is that it is something that I think you and I have discussed, or you've shared with me this idea that Fragile X, or the reality that Fragile X has a very strong representation in the Ashkenazic Jewish population.
Mhm.
And so
Yes, it
tell
does.
tell people what Fragile X is and how it
Right.
presents in males and females differently too.
It's really very complicated, but I'll do my best to kind of distill it. And it is, let me preface it by saying it's not considered sort of a Jewish genetic disease because it actually affects a wide population. However, like many genetic diseases, it affects the Ashkenazi population, particularly hard. Um, but it's not one of the sort of 38 identified Jewish specific genetic diseases. I've met now people from all over the world, all races, all backgrounds, all religions who are affected by Fragile X. But there definitely is a large proponent in the Ashkenazi community. Um, so Fragile X is exactly like what it sounds like. Your X chromosome appears differently than a typical X, right? And what it looks like is, there's a piece of it that appears fragile under a microscope, that appears unstable. So basically, anyone who has an X chromosome, which is everyone, males have an X and a Y, and females have two X chromosomes, has 0 to 50 repeats of a specific part of the X chromosome called the FMR1, right? Gene. This is like complex, but
Go for it.
it's there. It's everyone has that, and
We believe you.
it's part of your X chromosome. And if you're a sort of a typical non-fragile X carrier, you have 0 to 50 somewhere in there repeats of this FMR1 piece of your chromosomes. If you have more than 50 but less than 200, you are what's called a carrier of Fragile X. Now, kind of a misnomer because typically we think about carrier diseases as things that don't affect the carrier. You often need two people to come together to pass along the disease. You can carry something like cystic fibrosis, right, and not be affected by it unless you procreate with another carrier and pass it on, right? That's not how Fragile X works. Because of the mutation in the gene that causes the X to be unstable, you can have some health implications, including ovarian failure or premature menopause. Now, if you have over 200 repeats of this FMR1 gene, then you basically have full Fragile X, which is the number one inherited cause of autism and developmental delay. And typically in males is a very severe syndromic disability, physical and cognitive impairments, some nonverbal, um, behavioral challenges. It's almost a combination of sort of a Down syndrome and other, severely autistic presentations. And it can present that way in females as well, but it's typically a little bit less severe. Now, the reason for that is because females having two X chromosomes, the other X is considered protective in a way, which is why females are often a little bit less impacted by the full mutation, which is having the whole genetic syndrome. Does that make sense at
Yeah,
all?
no, that was a
It's
magnificent
really
explanation of it.
complicated.
It is, but and basically, like, the more repeats that we have
Mhm.
in the gene, the more complex the presentation of diagnosis. One question I have,
100%.
do we know of any other genetic disease or carrier-based disease that has presentation of illness or representation of illness in the carrier as well, or is this the only one?
That is a great question that I don't know the answer to. But now I'm going to try to find out because I think
Okay.
that is actually a really good question. I don't know of
I
any,
don't either.
but there may be some, um, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
So we'll have
Okay.
we'll have to dig into
We'll have
that
to
a little bit.
okay, fast. I'll have
So
to ask my genetic
yeah,
counselor person.
exactly.
Okay.
That's what I was thinking. Online to
Who's my
genetic
genetic
counselor.
person? Exactly.
Yeah.
Um, so once you know now, your physician tells you this is the reason for and I'm curious, you're using the word premature menopause. Often I hear the
Mhm.
terminology premature ovarian failure. I feel like there's a new word
Right.
that has shown up recently as well, right? Was there something
Right. The
new?
new word is premature ovarian insufficiency.
Insufficiency.
So
Okay.
that's sort of POI, they call it.
Okay.
And if you are in fragile, if it's Fragile X related, they call it FXPOI. So Fragile X related premature ovarian insufficiency. So technically, that is what they call it now. I call it menopause because for the layperson, that's a lot easier to understand. It makes
Sure.
sense. We can kind of picture it. The
And
reason that they have this
yeah.
new term, if you're curious, is because it is possible even for people who have had significant FSH levels and diminished reserve to spontaneously ovulate from time to time. It's a less than 5% chance, but it sometimes does happen.
Mhm.
Um, and that is why,
Interesting.
so it's insufficiency as opposed to failure, because in a very, very small amount of cases, it does happen sort of sporadically.
Interesting. Did they ever even attempt to do some kind of stimulation of ovaries to see if they could get
Mhm.
any eggs, or that was not even a discussion?
No, it wasn't even a discussion because of the state of my ovaries and the FSH combined. It would have been a fruitless endeavor, and on some level, I really appreciate that. I think that
Right.
they were very honest about it. That this isn't going to work. It's not likely to have any success whatsoever. The chance of recovering or retrieving any eggs is,
Mhm.
minimal
Mhm.
to none.
Right.
So to put
Right.
yourself through that for those results is stressful, expensive, and
Potentially
would have
unethical as well if they know that it's really not giving you what you need.
correct
So
exactly.
before we continue, I do want to ask you one other thing. I'm aware that there definitely are implications for somebody who's in premature menopause, because
Mhm,
menopause is supposed to have um the production of our or the value of some of the ovarian processes is not purely for conception, or the
mhm,
hormones related to our cycling are not just for conception, and there's a lot of things that are, I think, like protective of our bones and bone
mhm,
health and stability. Was that a discussion even at that time around
mhm,
like hormonal replacements, or like looking at longevity? What do we do with someone who is in menopause at 30, and how do
mhm.
we keep her healthy in the long run? Was that a conversation in 2008?
So yes, it was with Dr. Santoro.
Okay.
Definitely not in the reproductive endocrinology world, but
Okay.
because I think I sort of thought out this supportive care around menopause specifically, it
Mhm.
absolutely was a conversation with her. So actually, while I was waiting for a donor and waiting to cycle, she started me sort of immediately on hormone replacement. Actually, she just put me sort of back on birth control as hormone replacement during that time. But she did talk a lot about, sort of the health implications of ovarian failure at such a young age, right? Just like you mentioned, bones, heart, cognitive. There's a lot of pieces that go along with estrogen production primarily. Um, so she stressed the importance of, once was through the process and, had the children that I wanted, God willing, that I would then need to supplement hormones
Mhm.
kind of on an ongoing basis until I was about 50.
Okay.
And then kind of take it from there, as most people do when they naturally enter menopause, whether or not they
Right.
decide to, replace at that time. Then I would decide, do I continue or not?
Got it. Okay. So once you knew what you were dealing with, what
Mhm.
was, I think we have to touch for a minute on the emotional component of it, of finding out this information. And like, just
Mhm.
if you're willing to share, like, what was some of that emotional process for you like of knowing that you could not have a genetic child?
Sorry, I'm just putting. Um, yeah, well, it was a lot. I think it's certainly one of the things that kind of tipped me into specializing in infertility counseling when I became a therapist. Ultimately, when I ran my own practice, because there was so little emotional support really at that time. I felt very isolated. I felt pretty young to be in this pool of people who need donors. Even I'll never forget when I went in to talk to the billing woman um, at the RE's office. Basically, at the end of that appointment, when I found out in the news, kind of the first thing she said to me was like, "Are you sure you need a donor? You seem so young." Just like, and then I
Yeah.
just remember, just tears,
Sure.
right? Just falling apart. And, I think my husband got a little heated, and
Yeah.
yeah, it was,
Things that you
it was
should
a
never
lot.
say to someone. Yes. Okay.
Exactly. There's a
Okay.
lot of those things that came up. And it's very hard. I felt like basically right out of the gate, before I, really even thought that hard about trying to conceive. It was less than a year really that I had been trying to conceive. That I was told there was just no chance I would really ever have my own genetic child. And there was a lot of grief associated with that. On the other hand, I felt that I wasn't crazy, which I think was helpful, because I had had that experience of being written off really by my
Sure.
gynecologist at the time, being told that my symptoms weren't real, or that what I was learning in my research wasn't important, or that some people just never get their period back when they go off the pill, which I knew in my gut was incorrect. And in fact, now having done a lot of research around that, is completely wrong. That, most people get their period back within a month or two. And if they don't, that it signifies a problem, right? Sort of all of the things that I felt and I was being discounted for. Um, I sort of had a reason for, and that was validating in a way, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Yes.
It sounds kind of bizarre, but I felt almost like, oh my goodness, well, this is horrible, and also at least I'm not I'm not completely losing it. Um, so it was mixed, and it felt like there was some hope, that maybe it was possible to have a child, via donation. That gave me hope. The RE did say, you're young, you're otherwise healthy. This is really pretty successful, for people in your position. So that was encouraging. But the loss of the genetic piece is not small, right? It's very, very significant. It's huge. It's overwhelming. Um, and it was a lot to process. So I just had to kind of sit with it. Um, for me, I'm a doer, right? And I sort of go forward, take action. And for me, it was pretty easy to kind of quickly get my head around, like, well, okay, this is what it is. So here's the next steps, right? I had go forward with this process. And focusing on that kind of helped me get through it. For a lot of people, it does not work that way, and there's no right or wrong, right? Some people really need to take a lot of time to grieve, to get their head around it. to feel that they can accept it, maybe to try or to think about trying if that's a possibility. Because for some people it is, that maybe they have, much less of a chance, but not no chance of retrieving their own eggs. For me, it's really in the action
Sure.
that I go forward.
Sure.
So,
So what were the next steps like for you? Or just tell the people who are listening, like what happened
mhm.
next?
So basically, at the time, and again, it's very different in the world of infertility, as you know, where things change, in a nanosecond.
Yes.
So it feels like almost ancient history, 15 years ago now. Um, but at the time, the way that my clinic worked it was to have an anonymous matching program, where they had a donor coordinator, they called her, who was a psychologist. And her job essentially was to sit down with the couple, um, kind of talk to them, figure out who they are, what they, are looking for in a donor. And then from their pool of donors, kind of pick a match, right? Like
Wow.
we know well in the Jewish community, right? And making that match. She was actually a very hilarious tiny little Jewish woman, Helene,
A
and so
shotgun.
I
Total
right
shotgun.
exactly.
Uh-huh.
I felt comfortable with her because I felt like she understood us and kind of got where we were coming from. And that cultural piece, it's
Sure.
important, right?
Sure.
So, she sort of saw us for the people that we were, kind of professional, intellectual types and what we would be thinking about. Um, and again, their pool of donors was anonymous and local. At the time, there was very, very little open uh, gamete donation. So, particularly egg donation. So, to have a donor who was known, unless it was a family member, a friend, a sister, a relative, someone that you specifically already knew, uh, it was it was frowned upon to have a known donor, and it was discouraged. Now it's totally shifted the other way. But at the time, that was sort of the option that was open to me. I didn't really think that hard about it. If I could go back and do anything differently, that would be the piece I would do differently.
Mhm.
But at the time, I sort of did what I was, almost instructed to do, without a lot of critical thinking around it. And it's not that I regret it, but now sort of understanding more the process and looking at the research about donation, similar to adoption, where we sort of come from, the theory of have an adoption that's a secret almost,
Right.
and don't know anything about the birth parents, to now sort of encouraging adoptive parents to, you know, have a relationship or be open with the birth parents so that the child eventually has an opportunity to have some relationship with them. That's where we've sort of shifted to in large part with gamete donation, but it
Are
just
you really?
wasn't
Are you
that
seeing
thinking
that?
at that time. I am
Really?
seeing that. Yeah.
That's
Mm-hmm.
interesting because I mean, I think I
Mm-hmm.
was assuming when you were saying a known donor, meaning that you have much
Mm-hmm.
more information about the donor.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the couples that I'm working with are definitely not having any everything is
Mm-hmm.
de-identified. And are you
Yeah,
seeing a shift in that
I
way where they
am.
are more?
Yes.
Oh, how interesting.
Very
Interesting.
much a shift towards couples wanting that, and also research indicating that that is, sort of a really positive way to go. And that because of the fact that for the child, right, it's this
Sure.
loss or this unknown piece, and that ultimately being able to have some contact with, it doesn't have to be a lot, it doesn't have to be, you know that your best friends or they're a member of your family, but that having a child have the opportunity to, even if it's as minor as that, right? A clause in the contract that says they can be contacted at 18, right? When the
Yeah.
child is 18.
Right.
That used to be unheard of. And now that's
Right.
much more common.
Right.
Um,
I mean, it makes sense because we know that with all the
mhm,
registries that exist today and all of our,
mhm,
ancestry.com and 23andMe's, like,
Yep.
the likelihood of anonymity is out the window a long time
A
ago.
100%. Yep.
So we have to acknowledge the reality of finding each other, better to do it with an
Exactly.
upfront understanding versus a back end, this could be a disaster. I think about it as a therapist,
Exactly.
like what kind of counseling, how counseling would change in terms of working potentially
Mhm.
with a donor as well
Mhm.
as with the intended parents, but especially with the donor, where it may have always felt more of a transactional experience,
Yep.
that that is not the way it's going to look moving forward, and that that conversation has to change as a
Yes.
therapist. Very, very
And
important.
honestly, I think for clinics who used to be more in the business of recruiting the donors and keeping them in house, right? Which is again less the way it is now. Now we sort of have these big donor databases where people kind of look online, like you would, go
Right.
on match.com and read profiles and see
Yes.
pictures. And we even have egg banks, right? Where you have
Correct.
frozen eggs instead of coordinating specifically with a person, which I can talk a little bit more about. That I think is the future. We're pretty much there, but I think it's going to become more of the
Mhm.
standard, to just basically order eggs like you order sperm from a
Right.
bank.
Right.
When clinics were in the business of keeping their donors in house, for them, right, it
Right.
was a business model, right? They if It's a lot harder to recruit donors who would be open to being known because it is
Correct.
transactional for them. They don't think about it really much as having a relationship. They think, here, I'm giving you an egg and, right?
And
Like
I'm
it's up,
and
right?
I can go to college now. I can pay for my college bills. Exactly. And it is, and
Exactly.
I don't want to
And
undermine, I really don't want to minimize the gift that that is, but it is a more of a
right,
transactional,
a
experience.
hundred
I will say
percent.
to you,
And
but I will say to you, Abby, as far as I know, the Jewish donor banks are not functioning in that way. They are
right.
most definitely keeping it in-house. There's a lot,
Yes.
it is very much being billed as a transactional experience.
Right.
Many of these donors are donating many, many times. There's a lot
Yep.
of complexity in the Jewish donor banks, and we're really, really
Hmm.
limited in pool. We're not talking
Right.
about thousands of women genetics,
Exactly.
eggs that are available. And there's quite
Hmm.
a bit of we have a lot of concern in the religious community, especially where you might
Hmm.
see a much greater influence of saying we must use Jewish donor egg,
Hmm.
and how that's going to impact the future. No question about it.
Right. Absolutely. And I think it is different because it's a, very specific need and a specific, and there's a lot that goes along with that. And, I think kind of keeping it under wraps and not telling is maybe more the norm in the
Very much
religious
so.
community. And that's all religious communities, not just Jewish
Absolutely.
community.
Oh yeah.
And, I think that that's, kind of where we see more of that. But just to put it out there, right, the research is showing that for the child, the idea of being able to connect with and know a donor, however, tangentially, right, doesn't have to
Yeah.
be a deep, sort of meaningful relationship, but just sort of being able to have more information, yes, but also some contact, some, connection at some point,
Right.
is healthy for the child, takes
Yeah.
away a lot of anxiety and confusion, wondering, all of the things that we see with adoption.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I think is very powerful from the adoption story versus the donor egg story is that idea of like there isn't necessarily a loss or a grief thread in the donor egg
Hmm.
experience versus in the
Hmm.
adoption community experience, where like someone
Hmm.
placed or surrendered, or the wording we use today is placed for adoption, but somebody, from a child's perspective, somebody did not want me. And that's
Exactly.
quite different in the donor egg experience, where somebody
It's
actually,
much different.
it's quite different. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? And then I want to hear more about what that process was for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it is much different. I think that it's an easier story to tell a child in a lot of ways. And I think there isn't that sense of I was rejected or I was given away or
Right.
someone didn't want me. That's very much a big piece of the donor story is, you can really make it like this is it's a huge positive only, right? I always tell my kids, right, it took three people to make you, and isn't that amazing? And sort of what a gift that this is. But it comes back to identity, and that piece is still important, even if there's no sense of rejection or loss in terms of the genetic, contributor, right? That doesn't, that takes away some angst, I think, for the child, but it doesn't take it all away, right?
No.
There's this wondering of, if they know, again, and that's a separate issue, and we can get to that as well. Again, the research indicates telling the child, and helping them to navigate that. But there is still a lot of questions that come up for them, or they might feel, kind of that wanting to know. We all have that. Why is ancestry.com and 23andMe, why are they so popular? Why are people, so big into finding out their family trees and their genetic origins? Because we all want that. It helps us, feel grounded in the world, whether it's actually important or not, right? It's
Right.
not the point. Kind of as a society, we've made it important. We've decided that it is important, and therefore, children wonder. But for sure, not having to feel that they were given away or rejected is certainly, I think, a net positive in a donor story versus an adoption story. Not that one is better than the other. Certainly not what I'm saying at all.
Just different. Right.
But
Just
it's just
different.
different.
Right. Okay. So you went the donor egg route, not knowing who your
Mhm,
donor is, not having that much
mhm,
information about them. And
mhm,
today you have children from donor
mhm,
conception. Do you want to tell us
mhm.
a little bit about them?
Sure. And let me speak to why I went the donor route versus the adoption route, if that's okay, because
Sure.
I do think people do ask that, and sort of comes up a lot. Like, is an adoption a better option? There's already these children in need. For me, I felt that the fact that I would still be able to carry, control that environment, but also have that experience, right, of pregnancy and birth. That, to me, that was important. It felt like if I couldn't have the genetic connection, then that connection would be important. Also, I would know that half of the genetic material was my husband, so I would know that, that would be known. And to be frank, it was the quickest and the cheapest way towards having a child, compared to adoption, which can be very lengthy, arduous, and extremely expensive depending on how you go about it. So
Very
just kind of want
much.
to put that out there. Right? Again, not one better than the other, but for me personally, that felt like donor conception made the most sense for us.
Absolutely.
Um, and I don't think that's the case for everyone, but for us it was. So yes, I did know something about uh, my older daughter. So I have two daughters, Annabelle and Nadine. Annabelle is 14, about to be 15 in a couple of months, and Nadine is 11, about to be 12. And so for Annabelle, um, again, it really depends on what you're looking for in a donor. You can have people have long, lengthy lists. They sort of want everything under the sun. For me, I just kind of wanted a healthy egg. Um,
Mhm.
I understood that to replicate myself was going to be highly unlikely. To find someone who was just like me and in lots of ways, looked like me, liked the same kind of things. So my husband and I, we wanted a college educated donor, mostly because we felt like being able to get through that process of going to college and being educated was said something about, being of a certain level of maturity, and ability to follow through and directions, and also a certain age. So that was important, and otherwise, healthy, and that was basically our only requirements. So this Helene, she picked a donor for us. We did get probably about 5 pages of information about her, mostly her health history and her family's health history, um, some childhood pictures, and some information about, what she was doing, her interests, and her background. So we know a significant amount, but nothing identifying, and certainly, you know, it gives you a sense of who she was, but we don't know much beyond that. And so we were started this process in, I think I found out in January of 2008. We were matched with our donor in April. And at that time, again, since we weren't using frozen eggs, that wasn't even um, on the radar. You had to have a donor who you coordinated your cycle with. They went through the cycle, you went through the cycle at the same time. And then they did the egg retrieval from the donor and created the embryos and transferred directly. So that's how we worked it. And so by July, I was pregnant. So it was pretty quick. It worked on the first try. We had one embryo standing at the end of the, oh no, two. We had two with Annabelle. So they transferred two because, again, at the time that was something that they did. Now they're much more likely to transfer single embryos, especially in donor scenarios where the eggs are, in theory, embryos are healthy. And we conceived, and the rest is history. So
Right.
that was number one.
And was it of interest to you when you were ready to try again? Was it of interest to you to go back to the same donor?
It was, and we actually did. So, right. Sometimes you would have leftover embryos that you could freeze and store. Again, because the technology was not super new, but fairly new at the time. They really tended to be on the conservative side in terms of stimulating donors because young, healthy donors is very easy to overstimulate and have problems, resulting from that, which could be pretty devastating, even life-threatening. So they tended to sort of be very conservative. And our donor was a first-time donor. They're even less, uh, they take
Aggressive.
less
Yeah.
risk,
Yeah. Right.
less aggressive in that situation. Um, so we had no leftover embryos. So we went back to the clinic when we wanted to conceive again and asked if they could reach out to her, which they did. And she, I believe, had moved uh, maybe overseas, and she was not available to donate again. So in which case, then we started the process again, looking for another donor. We did actually reject a donor that we were matched with that time, that we didn't feel was a great fit just based on some of the things in her profile. And then the second donor that she offered us, we matched with and conceived my second daughter.
That's
Same
amazing.
thing, first cycle, successful.
Okay. So knowing, kind of, I think basically our conversation really ended up just kind of discussing quite a bit about genetics. One of the things that I
Mhm.
really want to make sure we touch upon before we finish up for this conversation, I really want to explore what else you found out about your genetics, because I think that
Mhm.
that's also kind of, the complexity of, okay, I have this fragile X. I am a fragile X carrier,
Mhm.
but you also found out that you were a carrier of BRCA, of the BRCA
Mhm.
gene. Can you tell us about
Mhm.
how that came about, and also what that means to you today? Not that this conversation
Mhm.
will explore that in depth. I think that could be another time, but just understanding our genetics is so necessary. What was that like for you?
Sure. So that's a whole separate story. But I'll try to keep it brief. In 2012, shortly after I had my second daughter, my good friend that I worked with, a fellow counselor who I worked at a domestic violence agency at the time, she was 31 and she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She found out that she was a carrier of the BRCA mutation, which causes breast cancer and ovarian cancer, among other things, in pancreatic cancer, prostate cancer, a lot of things. At a rate of something like 87%. It's very, very high risk. And she went through treatment, she got better, and then within a year, it had spread to her liver and metastasized. And so she was diagnosed as stage 4 terminal. Um, and she deteriorated pretty quickly after that because it metastasized to her spinal fluid.
Mm.
Um, and she I think after her diagnosis, she lived about 9 months. So it was very quick since she was 34 when she died. Prior to her dying, she would tell me a lot that she, if she had known, if she wished she had known about the BRCA mutation. And she said, it's 1 in 40 Ashkenazi Jews have a BRCA mutation. 1 in 40. I mean, that's like a lot, right? That's very, very high. That's 10 times the rate of the BRCA mutation seen in the typical population. So typical widespread population, it's 1 in 400. In the Ashkenazi Jewish population, it's 1 in 40, right? So, and that's men and women, which is important because either men or women can pass it down. And again, it's another mutation that you don't need to carriers to pass down. One person can pass it down in 50% of cases, right? So you have a 50-50 chance of passing it down to a child as a single carrier. And in my case, and we'll get to that, it was my father who passed it down. So she would talk a lot about wanting to advocate for that. She was Jewish and wanting to be involved in making people aware of that and testing. And she kind of was always on her soapbox about it.
Sure.
And so she talked a lot to me about testing. And I was like, listen, like, I don't have any breast cancer in my family. And my mother had uterine cancer, but that's not related to BRCA. It's like, no one's had breast cancer in my whole family, right? So just ask your doctor, please ask your doctor. So I asked my doctor, different doctor than obviously didn't go back to the one from clearly female doctor this time. But she said, really, it's not a lot of precedent for testing in people who don't have a family history, which, as it turns out, is not a good way to go. And she has now, since knowing me, reverse course on that and tests all of her Ashkenazi Jewish patients if they agree to it. So she basically told me, no, I won't test you because it's not worth it. And I was like, oh, okay, good. She thinks it's not necessary. It's fine. Fast forward a few months later, really my friend was very sick. And she kept saying, she was crying one day in the hospital and she said, I'm not going to live long enough to do any advocacy. And that's like one of my biggest regrets. And I want to be able to, for people to understand that they can prevent this. Just crying. So then I'm crying and I say, okay, we know what the Talmud says. You save one life, you save them all, right? I said, I'm going to get tested. If you save my life, you've done what you're here to do. Right.
Yeah.
And it was very emotional. And, she said, okay, are you promised you're going to get the test? And I said, I promise I will make my doctor do it. Like, I absolutely will get it done. Went back to my doctor. I said, you really just have to humor me on this. Like, she's dying. I promise I have to get it done. She did it. She did the blood test, which was covered actually in full. And because I think that's one of the reasons people don't do it, because they feel like it won't be covered. But there is actually in the ACA legislation, it's now included because President Obama's grandmother died of ovarian cancer. She was a BRCA carrier. So it's actually written in to the ACA legislation that it needs to be covered in the case of hereditary or high risk populations. So the cost shouldn't actually be a factor for people. So I got the test. She died at the end of August. And on September 9th, I got the results that I was BRCA positive.
Wow.
So I really do feel it was some divine intervention. I do really, it makes me emotional still when I think about it. My regret is that she didn't live to know that, but I feel like maybe somewhere, somehow she knows,
Would you like to say her name? Would you like to acknowledge who she is?
Sure. Her name was Cheryl Landman Nichols. And she, yeah, I miss her. I miss her all the time. She was just a great person. And, I can't say why our paths crossed. But I am grateful every day for her advocacy and for her insisting and for that Jewish connection and that being able to say to her, okay, right, this is what we believe, right? This is what we firmly believe, right? You save one, you save everyone and it's enough. It's enough. And now I do the work for her, right? And I say that a
Clearly.
lot,
Mhm.
right? Like I make it my soapbox, and I, have gotten many people to test for the mutation, really in her name, um, because I think it's really important and very much under recognized. The same day that I got the results of my MRI, because once I found out that I had the mutation, I started, becoming extremely anxious that maybe
Sure.
something had already been missed. I had an MRI and I had some other tests, and it all came back negative. And Elizabeth Wurtzel, who was a writer, of Jewish descent, published an op-ed in the New York Times about being a BRCA carrier. Same thing, passed down from her father, and now she had cancer. She ultimately died of cancer, and she talked in that op-ed about how, what a missed opportunity it is
Yeah.
to not routinely test Ashkenazi Jews who have such a high risk. Because again, I went on to have a preventative mastectomy. That isn't even what needs to happen. If people are aware that they have the gene, they can just do more aggressive monitoring. They can have, more frequent ultrasounds or MRIs, as opposed to what we typically do, which is nothing until 50. Um,
Right. Right.
now they've sort of upped the limits for when you should get mammograms. So
Really?
all of these
Yeah, I would
things
not
are, yeah,
recommend that. Yeah.
right.
Mm-mm.
No, and right. So
Right.
that's sort of the
Right.
opposite for
Right.
what
Wow.
Jewish women need in particular.
Right.
And BRCA, it affects men as well, something that we don't realize. Yes, they can get male breast cancer, but more than that, melanoma, prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer. Those are the big ones that that men present with who are
Mhm.
BRCA carriers. So again, because it can be passed down by men, in my family, it wasn't obvious because it was my father's father to my father. My father's father died when he was 49 of a heart attack. So if he had
Wouldn't
gone
have
on to
known.
develop cancer,
Right.
we wouldn't have
Right.
known.
Right. Right.
My father didn't develop cancer, but again, I had an 87% chance of breast or
Right.
ovarian cancer. Now,
Right.
another sort of weird divine piece of this that I always think about is the fact that because my ovaries failed at a young age, because of Fragile X, I had no estrogen for so many years, which feeds breast cancer and ovarian
Mm.
cancer.
Oh, fascinating.
And when I had, right, so,
Oh
in a
my gosh.
way,
It may have
right,
been protective of you in some
it
way.
may have been protective of me.
Wow. Wow.
And when I had my second daughter, I had a complicated delivery and I wound up having a hysterectomy emergently. And I said, well, please take my ovaries as well as my uterus.
Right. Sure.
And I was actually in a Catholic hospital and they were appalled and didn't want to do it, because I was young and, we can't do that. And I said, listen, when you get in there and you see, right,
What they
it's
look
going to be
the
fine,
raisins
what they
versus
look
the
like, right?
grapes. Right.
So they did. They took my ovaries, and
Oh,
this was
wow.
before I knew about BRCA. Shortly
Look at
before,
that.
about 2 years before. So I had my ovaries removed, and because you can still get ovarian cancer even of
Sure.
atrophied ovaries.
Sure.
So in a way,
Look at
right,
that.
even that, right, there's been these events that sort of all kind of coalesce, and it's very strange for me, but I try not to dwell too much. But I also, as much as I really hate the Fragile X, because of what it's taken away,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
some other ways, I see it as a gift, that protected me on some level. So it's complicated.
So
Genetics are
complicated. Yeah.
very, very complicated.
It really is, and I feel like again, as usual, I could talk to you for at least another hour on these issues, but I think we're gonna pause here. But
Mhm.
it is such a fascinating conversation around the genetics, especially the genetics related to specifically the Ashkenazic history and
Hmm.
kind of our genetic loading. And I think that
Hmm.
you presented the different ones, right? That we don't really typically think about the Fragile X. I are more
Hmm.
familiar, hopefully, with BRCA, although I have met women who have never heard of it before, and
Yeah.
it startles me today that there are women today that do not even know what we're talking about. And so
Hmm.
I believe that we're probably passing on some of that advocacy into the next,
I hope
kind of in the
so.
next sphere in the next audience to hopefully someday say
Cheryl
we've
would be
fixed
so
that.
grateful
Right?
that
Right.
that you've given me this platform to even mention it out into the world.
Absolutely.
That's exactly what
Absolutely.
she wanted to do, to be
Yeah.
able to, help her fellow Jews understand that this is, among us and important,
Yeah.
and that there's
Yeah.
something we can do about it, right? That there's
Absolutely.
something we can do, which is knowledge is power. Um,
Agreed.
and I think there's a lot of fear around it, but we don't have to be afraid, to know what's going on in our own bodies. We just know, and then we kind of figure out what the best path is from
Right.
that point forward.
Yeah.
But that there's no reason, to have that fear.
Yeah. This, I mean, yeah, and I think that there's so much more to talk about. We didn't even touch upon shame and about grief and about
Mhm.
communal expectations. Like we didn't even go there yet. That'll have to be for another time. But this was a fascinating conversation,
Happy to come
Abby.
back
I
anytime.
will be asking.
And there's a
You know
lot more.
me.
I can talk a lot more about
I know.
raising donor kids, donor
I
conceived kids, and
Yes, we're gonna do
all of
that.
those things. Anything that you want to talk about, I'm
Amazing.
here. I'm
Thank you
here
for your
for it.
generosity. Really, thank you for your
Of
generosity of
course.
time and spirit and advocacy that we
And
just will keep
thank you
pushing
for
that
being
forward.
you, doing this work, and,
Oh, it's my
sort
pleasure.
of helping the community to understand, all of these complex issues, which is not
Yeah,
easy. So
absolutely. Thank you
you're
again.
doing amazing work.
Thanks. Thanks, Abby.
Okay.